Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I can report to you that in response to our subject of never waste a good crisis, in the United States, we wasted the good crisis. So it cheers me up to find people who still look for how you do that. And so when we talk about structural labor market reform, there is not a lot to report. I do want to say before I get into a few things before I get into my prepared remarks. First of all, some of this you may know, some perhaps not. But in the Great Recession, as we call it in the United States, during the first 2 years that President Obama was in office, before we had the 2010 elections and the arrival of the Tea Party and the current political mess that we have in the United States, and really an inability to get anything done, we did have in 2009 the American Recovery Act, our stimulus legislation, which actually did quite a lot to ameliorate the effects of the recession in the United States. Paul Krugman wrote, I think correctly and repeatedly, in the New York Times that the stimulus should have been about twice the size, given the depth of the recession. But we did spend a record amount, at least ever since the Great Depression, about close to $800 billion over a 2-year period on various things that were intended to cushion the effect of the recession. So we had extended unemployment insurance. We had an increase in the benefit of food stamps, which is it's actually our basic, if you don't know, our basic income level, baseline income for everyone, like a family allowance. It added to the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, which are measures that get extra money to families with children who are working. Our temporary assistance for needy families, our cash assistance for mothers and children, it was added to with an emergency fund, and in fact it was the only job creation that we had during the recession, about 250,000 jobs. It's a big country, so that's not so many, but 250,000 jobs. And we had added funds in child care and in housing vouchers, which helps pay the rent for low-income people. So we did a lot. One thing we did not do that I think was unfortunate is that we had no, other than what I just said about TANF, no large job creation plan during the recession. For us, that would not have been, had we done it, something where the money went to private businesses, as was discussed this morning. It would have gone for publicly created jobs, whether they were carried out by governments or whether the money was given to nonprofits, to NGOs. So we did have this considerable activity, and in that sense, we did not waste the good crisis, but these were all temporary things. The longer-term trends in the United States are, and I'll go into them in more detail, but just to give you a very brief summary, and are not unfamiliar to all of you. We have had increasing inequality for 40 years. We've had a weak bottom half of the labor market for 40 years. We've had very significant stickiness in terms of mobility over that period of time. We've had an increase in the number of temporary workers, part-time workers. We've had within the bottom half, or actually below twice our poverty line. Our poverty line, 19,000 for a family of three. We have a fixed poverty line. You probably mostly know that. It sounds a little strange to maybe to European ears that we don't connect to the median wage in the way we measure poverty. But in any case, or the median income, between twice the poverty line and zero, we have about the same percentage of the population as we've had for 40 years, but it's redistributed down, so that the percentage who are poor, out of that, a third or so of the population who are below twice the poverty line, the percentage who are poor has gone up. The percentage who are in what we call deep poverty, have incomes below half of our poverty line, that has gone up. I'll say more about that. Unions in the private sector have diminished greatly in their size and power, including also a weakening of our National Labor Relations Board, which regulates unionism and collective bargaining. We've had, because of what's happened to our economy generally, and not just in the recession, things that you're very familiar with in terms of greatly increased problems for young people getting into the labor market, particularly young people of color. Older workers, more and more sort of pushed out before the regular retirement age, ex-offenders, and of course we have a lot of them in the United States, having a very difficult time finding a job. Women who, single mothers who are on cash assistance, or should be if we had a better system, find it difficult. All of that is people who are on kind of the periphery of our labor market are in increasingly difficult situations. Our labor market institutions have weakened. Long-term unemployment still very high in the recession and having a very slow recovery. And the auto companies coming on back, as you know, workers have come back at lower wages than the jobs were when things came close to collapsing. So just to put that out there as a kind of initial frame. A second piece maybe of an initial frame would be to say, although I've said a little bit, what our policies are, and I'm not sure whether in a shorthand it will be as informative as we would want it to be, but we certainly do not have active labor market policies. We've tried things over the years. We haven't done them very well. We have had what I guess I would call an active labor market for women who are on welfare, who are on cash assistance with their children, but it's a deeply, deeply flawed effort, very, very problematic. Maybe veterans. Veterans are among the deserving poor in our country, so maybe we do a little better job there. In terms of course, we not so much in relation to recession, but in general, we do have a minimum wage in the United States, which has lost ground to inflation. We have we could say that the line between deserving and undeserving poor, going back 70 years, 75 years, has gradually changed so that first the elderly became deserving, then the disabled, and finally the working poor with children. And that's why we have the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit as wage supplements for essentially women, anybody actually with low wages and children. It could be two people in a household. But it makes a difference. Just to give you the idea on that, a minimum wage job pays about $15,000. If you have two children and you have that one job in the household, the Earned Income Tax Credit adds $5,500. The Child Tax Credit adds $1,500 more. In other words, about $7,000, almost a 50% add-on to income. So It's not fabulous, but it makes a very, very tangible difference. And so that what we've done is we've said that the low wage, especially with children, as I said, are deserving to a degree anyway, and people who we regard as other, who are outside that, namely in the case of women with children who would have qualified for cash assistance, they are now very clearly the undeserving in our public attitudes and our politics and so on. I'll talk about that in more detail later on. But our safety net for people who are not working includes unemployment insurance, which is itself has holes, includes food stamps, which is this uniquely American invention, but really think family allowance. It provides, if you have only food stamps, about a third of the poverty line, so somewhat over $6,000 for a family of three. So hardly enough to live on. But if you go back to the time in the 1960s when we found that we had children in the United States who were had a level of malnutrition in some parts of the United States that was like a third world country, we don't have that anymore, as much as we have some very deep poverty. And then we do have a small cash assistance program for children still, and I'll talk more about that. And then, of course, we have our policies on disability, and we see in terms of whether people really, shall we say, are disabled. You have some of that in some of your countries where disability has become a kind of baseline of income for many people. Older workers, we see older workers going on disability more than we used to. For obvious reasons, the labor market doesn't want them. So that's, for what it's worth, I thought I would just add that, having listened to the good discussions this morning, just add those sort of framing remarks. The 2011 statistics on poverty in the United States were released just a week or so ago. You may have seen the coverage here. What they suggest is that maybe, in terms of the level of poverty, the American recession may have bottomed out. The number in poverty, which is 46 million, about 15% of our people, is the same as it was in 2010. These are 2011 numbers that come out in September of the following year. That's our usual way of doing it. Hardly anything to cheer about, but maybe we've hit that bottom. Also, what did happen that was negative is that the middle is still losing ground in the United States, and so the median income went down as it had for 7 of the last 10 years, and inequality widened. The people at the top had a little bit more of a bump up on their incomes, so the Gini coefficient showed that. The current political situation in our country, maybe it will change slightly in November. I certainly hope so. But it is toxic, and it really, perhaps the biggest news is that many of these policies that I outlined very quickly are actually threatened. You probably read about the attitudes about Medicare, our program for the oldest, for our elderly. The Republicans have talked and now deny having talked about changing it into a voucher where instead of the government paying for the medical procedures, people would be given a voucher to go fend for themselves in the private market. So that's the kind of area, the kind of issues with which we're dealing. The underlying facts are problematic even without the recession. There are three forces that frame the history of American poverty over the last 40 years that I want to talk about. One is changes in the economy that have produced a flood of low-wage jobs, and I will suggest that we showed Europe the way, that we got there first. But we could argue about that. In any case, it becomes visible in the United States in the early 1970s. And it's obviously the same kind of thing that is true everywhere, heavily caused by globalization and by things that happen as a result of globalization. The second area is that of changes in family structure. I'll come back to that. So many more single moms in the population, and therefore in the labor force. And finally, somewhat different from your countries, we, as you know, have continuing issues regarding race. So race and gender are very much a part of our American picture. An additional problem in the United States in the post-1960s story is the growth of concentrated poverty, especially in inner cities. And this is disproportionately an issue for people of color. And it represents...
Push the button.
Oh, I'm done. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, bye. That was great. I got off easy. Okay. Thanks, Paul. Talking about concentrated poverty, and I was just saying that it's really the biggest example of persistent and intergenerational poverty, both, and that's both inner cities and rural areas in the United States, like Appalachia and Indian reservations, the Mississippi Delta, and so on. And of course, as every child's future depends on strong child development from birth on and full educational opportunity on through post-secondary education, the significant ways in which we've fallen short in those areas are also of enormous importance. So that's the sort of quick summary of the last 40 years. Put some numbers on the table. As to poverty itself, that's one subject. Second is people who are not in poverty but are short of having a living income. And the worst part of the picture, as I said, are people whose incomes are below half the poverty line. And we'll also put some numbers about race and gender and age on the table, too. And then we can talk about why we don't do better. Well, so I mentioned the American poverty line, $19,000 for a family of three. It's also $23,000 for a family of four. And that's our peculiar American way of measuring poverty. I could give you a wonderful detour about how we happen to have that. A lovely story involving a woman who us poverty nuts in the United States remember so well. Her name was Molly Orshansky. So anyway, she's the person who invented our poverty line. The 46 million now poor. Fact to note about that is that that's up by 15 million people just since the year 2000. 6 million more before the recession started, 9 million more in the recession. We were actually doing, for us, pretty well in the year 2000 when President Clinton left office. But it might help you to know a little bit of the history. When we started measuring poverty in the beginning of the 1960s, we had actually 22% of our people were poor, and we cut that in half through the 60s and down to 11.1% in 1973. And so it's important to know that we're not in a fixed, that things do go up and down. That's the lowest figure we ever had. And it went up and down, and as I said, went down to 11.3% in 2000, which was largely the result of the hot economy of the 1990s. And then we have this increase that I mentioned. Now, then, secondly, the group that I mentioned who have twice the poverty level, that's now at what I think is an importantly troubling number. 106 million people, 34.4% of our population, incomes below twice our poverty line. And that actually went up, as I said, by 3 million from 2010 to 2011. The incomes below half the poverty line, that group totals now, or in 2011, 20.4 million people, 6.6% of our population. And that has doubled the percent who have incomes who are so low that they're at $9,500 for a family of three. That went from 3.3% of the population in 1976 to 6.6% now. And I mentioned about what food stamps does, what it provides, that very modest baseline of income. There are now 6 million people whose only income in the United States is from food stamps, which again I think is a very troubling, somewhat surprising number. 6 million people. Then just race, gender, and age. So you know, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans all have poverty rates nearly triple that of whites, about 27%. Single mothers with children under 18, single mothers with children under 18 are poor at a rate of 42.6%. Tough to be a single mom, and that's cutting across all races. Children are the poorest group in our country. Now, why are they the poorest group? Because their parents are poor. And again, that connects to single moms. And so children became the poorest age group in our country in the 1970s because we did a good job for the elderly. And so Social Security and something we call SSI, Supplemental Security Income, and other steps transformed the elderly from being the poorest age group to the least poor. All right, so now let's turn to the story that goes with those numbers. President Reagan once said, "We fought a war on poverty and poverty won." He was wrong. You wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that about many things that he said. But listening to those numbers that I gave you, you might think that it sounds like he's right. We still have 46 million people in poverty. You need to know that the policies that we have, and I mentioned most of them, but including Social Security for the elderly, are keeping 40 million people out of poverty in the United States, so that we would have nearly twice the number of people that we do have who are poor if we did not have those policies. So how does this fit together? Very successful public policy over here, 46 million people still in poverty over there. How can both of these things be true? Well, as we're talking about, and as you certainly know in Europe, as your own trends go, the United States has become a low-wage nation. Post-World War II was a golden age for us. We had the world market to ourselves after World War II. Our unions thrived. Industrial jobs that didn't require much education and workers' wages grew rapidly. The American middle class was built. And then we started having deindustrialization, globalization, starting in the 1960s. But in 1973, the year of the first oil shock, the indicators turned downward as though a switch had been thrown, if you look back at those trends. So beginning then, low-wage service jobs replaced the lost manufacturing jobs, and unions began to lose members and power. Minimum wage lost ground to inflation. Global competition continued to do its work. Trade policy had something to do with it. Immigration on the illegal side had something to do with it. And so the consequences for us are this. The median wage in the United States, half the jobs in the United States, if you have them full-time and all year, pay less than $34,000 a year. So what is that? 20,000 euros, I guess. That's half the jobs. A quarter of the jobs pay less than our poverty line for a family of four, less than $23,000. And those wages are stuck. That minimum wage has grown by, when you take inflation into account, has grown by only 7% in the ensuing 40 years, almost 40 years. And of course, that's not how much our economy grew. All of the gains that we had stuck at the top. We've had this widening inequality ever since then. So that's a huge growing of the gap between the top and the bottom. So when we talk about skill bias, technological change, and why we have workers who have low skills, we always have to keep in mind the demand side, what the jobs are like that are available. I think that's a bigger factor, not to take away from the fact that we did not do a good enough job of bringing along workers who had the full skills. And it's desperately necessary in the U.S. and I'm sure in Europe to get people an education that prepares them for the jobs of the 21st century. But the fact that everyone should want their children to get the best possible education, that doesn't necessarily mean that the jobs are going to, in sufficient numbers, the good jobs are going to be there in sufficient numbers. And in the United States, we are in denial about the facts about low-wage work. Millions of people know that they're not earning enough to make ends meet, but they tend to see their situation on an individual basis. Their own failure or bad fortune, they tend not to see that they're each one a small part of a deep structural flaw in our labor market and in our economy itself. And more than any single thing, low-wage jobs are the reason why so many people are still in poverty in the United States. And one of the facts when you look at our census and all the tables and so on, you have to dig pretty far down into the tables to find this. 61% of the income of the poor in our country comes from work. And I think the typical reaction, the person on the street in the United States, you say poor, they think welfare, they think race, they think black. And they think everybody who's poor is on public benefits. Well, I guess that's what I mean when I say they think welfare. So if the United States, as I said, hadn't enacted the public policies it did, things would be a lot worse. Now, to make things worse, we've had huge changes, very major changes in family structure. And there's a great deal of public debate, not all of it constructive, I might say, about why this is, but it's certainly important in relation to low-wage work. The question of how many unmarried births occur is actually a worldwide phenomenon, that it cuts across racial lines, doesn't seem to matter to some people in our country. And so we hear the problem isn't about unmarried women and getting a job and earning enough, and all that is the result of personal irresponsibility. It can be just fixed if everybody would get married. I mean, you've heard those arguments, and I guess I won't go there now. But it's very much in our discourse in the United States. Well, when the problem of low-wage work began to manifest itself, many two-parent families had a second possible wage earner, mom. And they sent her out into the job market, and they were able to earn enough to make things work. But the single mom who had nowhere to turn to get a second income was stuck. And so it's no wonder that children are our poorest age group in the United States. And also, so this is a gender issue. Women and children are the disproportionate victims of the extreme poverty that I talked about, of having incomes below half the poverty line. And this is because of what has happened in the United States to cash assistance for mothers and children as a result of the so-called welfare reform legislation that was enacted in 1996. The idea of a universal floor of income is something that Europeans are used to. In the United States, we've sort of, what should I say, snuck up on it with food stamps. In a very minor or in a modest way. But welfare was always means tested, and beginning in the late 1960s became the target. It was called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, as most of you know, became the target of an unremitting attack from the right. And this was racial politics, because the recipients of the program were disproportionately African Americans, although whites were always the largest group. And whites are the largest group in poverty. Same thing in the United States. But African Americans, Latinos are disproportionately poor. So politicians of the right, and I'm now going back more than 40 years, it was no longer acceptable to run a politics that was racial on its face. Right? They couldn't use the N-word. They couldn't stand in the schoolhouse door to stop the children from coming in anymore. And so they seized on welfare and crime as their racial politics. That's very much key to the American story about what happened to welfare. And I will say that American liberals let those attacks gain momentum. And there were too many people who were on welfare, and this is very important as you get pressures in your own countries about what you're doing about your income programs, and we had a little bit of a reference in Giuliano's discussion about pressure, and I would just sort of put a caution flag up there because I think most of us, although not all, but I think most of us, including me, think that we want people to be in the labor market and finding work and getting off the welfare rolls. And we really didn't do that. I mean, we included the Democrats as well as the Republicans up through the 1990s. We really, I worked for Robert Kennedy, as Paul said, and he made a speech in 1967 saying that our welfare system was bankrupt. And that it was hated as much by recipients as it was by those who gave out the money. Because it really didn't help people to become self-sufficient, to get jobs. So when President Clinton took office, there were 14 million people on welfare. He was a new Democrat, quote unquote, and to show his difference, he promised to end welfare as we know it. That was his bumper sticker, and he did. And so that's the law that we have now, temporary assistance to needy families. No legal right to help, 5-year time limit for any family to receive help. In the early years, the economy was hot in the United States, and women who had not been working, single moms who were receiving welfare, went to work in large numbers, in part because mostly because the economy was hot, and in part because the Earned Income Tax Credit added substantial income to the low-wage work. And to some extent, I will say that the push on them from the new policy. But understand this, that the difference between the difference that this program made and its consequences. Food stamps in 2007, remember I said there's a legal right to food stamps, went from 26.3 million people in 2007 to 46.2 million now, 20 million more people. You go to the office that makes those benefits available, they have to give it to you. Welfare by the beginning of the recession had gone down from that 14 million number I mentioned down to 3.9 million. In the recession, it went up by 500,000 people. 20 million food stamps, 500,000 TANF. Why? No requirement, no legal right. They didn't have to give it to the family that came, and there's a longer story about how the states had already programmed that TANF money for other purposes. Anyway, that just tells you the story. So the fact is that TANF is effectively non-existent in much of the United States. Before TANF was enacted, AFDC reached 68% of children in poor families. Now it's 27%. Half the states in our country, it's less than 20%. The state of Wyoming wins our prize. 600 people, give or take, on any given day. That's mothers and children combined in that whole state receiving cash assistance, fewer than 4% of the children. And all of this does not stop the right in our country from continuing to play race politics with welfare. We've just had some stuff in the presidential campaign about that, an accusation from the Romney side that Obama is trying to stop the work requirement for welfare recipients. So we've blown an enormous hole in the American safety net because it's really just food stamps. That's that 6 million people who have food stamps and no other income. So race not only figures as an impetus in the politics of welfare, but also it figures in the continuing and very substantively difficult story of the American inner city. Because when the American economy changed so greatly in the 1970s, if our economy caught a cold for lower people in the lower half, our inner cities got pneumonia. And inner city neighborhoods, which had always been segregated both by public policy and by the private policies of lenders, at least they had been three-dimensional in income and class terms before that. But with the civil unrest in the 1960s, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and the expansion of the black middle class, many African Americans moved out of those neighborhoods, and the remaining residents were more heavily low income. And combined with bad schools, increased crime, other manifestations of weakened social capital caused the neighborhoods to deteriorate just as the economy was weakening the chances for the residents to find decent jobs. So that is our most serious problem of poverty. The problems that get us up to 46 million, if we had the political will, we could get the kinds of supports for people in low-wage work and in a safety net that would end or greatly ameliorate the poverty of most of those who are poor. Inner cities, much, much more complicated. But more broadly, I think there's a well-founded fear in America that the children of the middle class are not going to do as well as their parents. And in the inner cities, now we have children being born, boys especially, into a cradle-to-prison pipeline. that marks them, puts a stigmatization on them that's going to mark them for life. And the bigger reality is what I call a cradle to nowhere pipeline, which is a deadly interaction of schools that don't teach and poverty and a lack of positive adult role models, both at home and in the community. So that is not only intrinsically tremendously important, but it contributes to the racialization of the politics about poverty, to the image that too many Americans have of poverty as being black and being an inner city woman who is on welfare, even though, to this day, even though welfare barely exists anymore. And if they think young man or male, it's somebody who's in prison or on his way, and again, is black. So, very important to emphasize the importance of investing in the next generation. Very key in terms of early childhood development. We know the science on that. Very key in terms of the jobs of the 21st century, as I said. Imperative to work on those questions. When Heckman talks about pre-5-year-olds as his solution, it's wholly oversimplified. And we need to be talking about education all the way through, and especially pathways that will get people into the labor market for the 21st century jobs, which means career and technical education, and it means our uniquely American community colleges playing a major role. So why is it so hard to end poverty in America? Well, the answer is a combination of an economy that's been punishing its lower half for 40 years, with the worst injury being to the people at the bottom, and the continuing impact of race, ethnicity, and gender on societal attitudes and politics, and on the operation of such key entities as the schools, the criminal justice system, and financial institutions. And the fact is that most people who experience poverty in the United States do not remain in poverty. They go in and out. And the big challenge, as I said, are those who are persistently poor, intergenerationally poor, whose situation, among other things, shapes the behavior of politicians and the attitudes of the public generally. The poverty of people of color, even though they're a minority of the poor, shapes the behavior of politicians and public attitudes. Making all of this worse is the widening disparity, steadily widening disparity between the top and the bottom, and the fact that powerful interests, corporate and individual interests, are stopping us from having the revenues that we need to run our country, including the revenues that we would need for a decent anti-poverty set of policies. We're eroding the promise of opportunity and inclusion that's the premise of our democracy. We desperately need a different politics. Economic power is calling the tune too much of the time in our politics, with the consequence that the politics exacerbate poverty and inequality. So until the United States takes a different political direction, making further progress on poverty will remain difficult. Thank you for the chance to share these remarks.
Hi, I'm Farida Hussein. I work for the Dutch government for the Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment. Thank you for your lecture, very interesting, inspiring. I have a question. Actually, maybe a lot of questions, but I'll just start with one.
I'll see you later.
Just for clarification, you're saying that children are part of the largest group of poor in the U.S., and that's mainly because their parents are poor. But then you also mentioned that it's not intergenerational. So how could you clarify that? Are you saying that maybe on the long run?
Intergenerational, meaning from parents to children, and children grow up, yes?
So if the parents are poor and the children are poor, growing up poor, is there a chance that in the future those poor children right now will not be poor in the future?
Yes, and we want to improve our performance in that regard. If children who, I mean, we have a lot of statistics on the number of children at the present time who were born into poverty, the disproportionate number who end up being poor as adults. But the breaking the cycle has to do very much with schooling. It also has to do with living in a community that is healthy and safe and where there is social capital. So it's not just schooling, but the single biggest variable is if a child has access to good early childhood programs and on all the way through until he or she gets to adulthood, that's how we break through.
Okay, that's a possibility of breaking through, but do you think that's likely to happen, that even though the children are poor, they're not socially excluded because their chances are not...
Well, your reference to, I said that most of the poor get in and out of poverty. Those children have a better chance because they're more likely to be going to a school that's not overwhelmingly other poor children. And so more likely to kind of gain their own social capital from other sources. Do I think, am I optimistic? I think we have a lot of work to do. That's the main point. There is more of an effort now, I will say, and many of you know this, to improve education in inner city schools than we've ever had. We're seeing some successes. There's a big debate about, I don't know if you know about charter schools. You sound like you might be American, or at least you went to school, I don't know. But in any case, we have something called charter schools that are an independent public school. Now, they themselves are a mixed story, but some of them have had very good results in teaching low-income children and getting them on to college in greater numbers than was the case before. But I would say on all of this, I'm an optimist. That's my, you know, I whatever got put on the earth this way. And I think that if we work on these things, now I will tell you, and I think you all know this, that there is a possible improvement in our politics for a demographic reason over the next 30 years, which is that we're getting to be a blacker and browner country. And that's not a sure thing. I mean, don't just sit there and assume that that'll make everything wonderful. But it's promising.
Okay, can we keep it like this? Because I'm afraid you are giving a second lecture, which is quite interesting, but I would like to give some other people opportunity.
You have to come up here and give me the hook.
Yeah, okay.
There was, up in front there was a question.
Yeah, okay, here is a question at least. But,
Right, well, okay.
My name is Natasha van der Zwaan. I work at AIAS. I have a couple of questions maybe about...
Well...
Okay. I'll converge it into one question then.
Good,
you mentioned
you're smart, yeah.
As underlying causes of poverty in the US, the kind of structural changes in society and the economy. You also mentioned policy. And I was wondering if there also is a big role to be played here for culture, specifically political culture.
Political.
I'm thinking, for instance, the way in which poverty, or at least income inequality in the US, has been largely hidden for a lot of people because they've been able to maintain lifestyles through indebtedness. I think the average number of credit cards an American owns these days is 8. So that's pretty substantial. And the other thing that might be of importance is the fact that Americans are generally very much averse against government intervention, as well as increased taxation. And I was wondering if those two factors, on the one hand, kind of poverty or maybe broader income inequality being largely hidden, as well as perhaps the lack of opportunity for political change because of the very specific nature of American political culture, if these could be other obstacles, and what your thoughts are about that. Thank you.
okay, 2 questions hidden in one, I think.
Answer.
Please go ahead.
Answer, yes.
Yes, that's your full answer?
Well, one thing is that we've had 2 ways that people have coped with the low-wage work. One is they sent mom out to work. That was a long time ago. And the second is that when that was sort of, as time passed, not good enough, they started borrowing money on their house, if they had one, or on their credit cards. And that has run out as well. So we're finished with having little piggy banks that we can dip into. The second point, the answer really is yes, and then that is to say that we have a lot of political work to do. We started a little bit with Occupy, with getting the 1% and the 99% into people's consciousness. It ran into the electoral cycle, and it kind of went away because many of us are so busy trying to reelect President Obama that it's not the particular time to push these larger issues. But for the reason I said to the woman back there, I am an optimist, and I think that we have a tremendous challenge to reach those people in the lower middle who are voters and who are hurting, and in too many cases, they don't see exactly why it is that they are where they are, and so we need to reach them.
Okay, thank you.
Did I do better? That was shorter?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
There was one more here, or do you not want to do it?
One final...
Yeah.
Oh, I think you were first. Is that correct or not? Yeah, so
okay.
you get a final opportunity, but
I'm trying.
To you later on.
Hello, I would like to ask a question about productivity and wages in the US. Economists often like to think when they look at wages and productivity, they move in tandem. Empirically, they often do, but in the United States, there's a disconnect between productivity levels and wages since, I think, the 1970s or something. This is always something that has been referred to often by politicians, the left-hand side of the spectrum in the US. One explanation might be that there's a bigger part of non-wage compensation, for example, because of healthcare insurance. But do you have a view on this? What does explain this disconnect and this different experience regarding productivity?
Between productivity and wages?
Yeah, because it's so different compared to other countries.
Well, Giuliano said something that struck me that I think is one among the many wise things that he said. But he said, if the person that you take your shirts to be ironed is charging you too much money, you'll iron them at home. And a lot of the low-wage work in the United States, now not all of it, but a significant amount of it, are jobs that are sort of inherently low-wage, or they wouldn't exist at all. Although they do give us a bargain, because we get people who do things for us who are being paid a substandard wage, even though we might do it ourselves if we had to. But we shouldn't make any mistake about that. There are very large employers in the United States who are low-wage employers. Walmart is at the very top of the list. And I believe Walmart would still be in business if they paid their workers somewhat more money. That people would adjust. Maybe some people would go to Target or Costco, what have you. But I think that the low-wage question is somewhat malleable with the proper organizing and so on. And to the extent that it's not, the debate we need to have in the United States, and I'm sure this is something that you were thinking about, is what to do about supplementing the wage more. And that gets very complicated because we don't want to give a free ride to the businesses for things that they're responsible for. And we've already got the Earned Income Tax Credit, and what I always say is that the Earned Income Tax Credit needs to exist in a very, very heightened tension with the minimum wage, so that we should always be pushing the minimum wage to the highest level we can politically, which, by the way, will be far short of the damaging effect that too high a minimum wage can have on the number of jobs. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think for these lower wage jobs, with the exception of those that are for actually very large, very successful companies, there is a divorce between the productivity and the wage.